Test, 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 test. All right, I tell you what, why don't we begin? Um, so I just want to first test the volume, but Craig is not. Oh, Craig, you didn't do well in that closing song either. I got to be honest. It's tough working with these people. Okay, volume, is this good enough? Arlene, can you hear me okay? Because you look a little sleepy back there. Um, okay, did you know today is the feast day of St. Francis? So we're going to, might as well start with a prayer of St. Francis. So Craig wanted to chant it. So thank you, Craig. So, okay, let's begin. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is giving that we receive, and it is pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is dying that we're born to eternal life. Amen. Actually, I'm impressed you guys know that one. That's great. So this class is part 2 on the Desert Fathers. So the rest of the classes will just be one, but I just couldn't do justice with one class, so I split it in 2. So last week, just talked about how the Desert Fathers fled the world, and what it means to flee the world really means to put an end to this need for everything the world and the culture says is great. The second thing I mentioned was they had this line, which I always think is kind of funny, flee the bishop. Technically, the whole line is, flee the bishop as you would a woman. But yeah, if you're supposed to be a celibate monk, although there were females as well. But when it says flee the bishop, it doesn't mean literally flee the bishop. But at the time period, first started with persecutions, and then suddenly the Roman Empire is Catholic. But then you have all this politics and arguing. So when they say flee the bishop, they mean it is so easy to get sucked into church politics and think that you're fighting for religion, but you're really not. Does that make sense? A lot of that doesn't make sense to you people. Is that does or doesn't? Oh, I don't know. It's, honest to God, you should see what I have to look at. It's tough to work with. Like this sounds kind of strange. I'll give you an example of flee the bishop. It doesn't mean the bishop. It means politics or all that stuff. Like this one priest, and there's several priests who do this, that they insist on calling him, having people call you by the last name. So you wouldn't call me Father Len, you'd call me Father McMillan. But think about that. That is not how the church worked in the early times. Even Jesus says Father Abraham in the story. Or in the Desert Fathers, it's Father Anthony or Father Macarius or Father if you look at the early church, you'd call them by your first name, not your last name. Does that make sense? Nobody calls St. Francis by his last name, do you? So it's actually only in the Middle Ages where you need to be slightly above people that priests started to say, oh, you have to call me by my last name because we're not on personal terms. Does that make any sense? That's just politics. But I will tell this story and I think this is funny. I know I shouldn't mock people, but let's face it, you know my personality. This one priest was always insisted that people call him by his last name. So anyhow, he was at a bar, and one of his parishioners came over and saw him, and he's not dressed in clerics, comes over and says, "Oh, Father so-and-so." And he says, "No, if you see me here, call me Frank." Suddenly, there wasn't a need for church politics. I just think that's so funny. So today we're going to cover a lot more. Those are just two in the background. But I want to start off with a story about Saint Evagrius. And Evagrius was a desert. Um, so Evagrius, I just think he has kind of an interesting life. He he fell in love with a married woman. This is before his conversion. Fell in love with this married woman, gets into a little bit of problem, really kind of has to run with his life, heads out, then gets sick, and then this other woman who's very holy tells him some sort of story where he's got to turn his life around. So the sickness wasn't really bad. So this woman says, "No, you got to dedicate your life and be serious." So after that, it becomes this desert monk and has a life of prayer and penance. And his major teachings was, and he was amazing. You know, the Desert Fathers believed in a lot of self-examination, but it was Evagrius who first describes 8 types of obsessive thoughts that can occupy a monk, or a nun. And so really the thing I like is that the Desert Fathers were early psychologists. And now they call them demons, but there's really, like, he switches back between obsessive thought and demons. And I like the phrase demon because, like, I have anxiety issues. I like to call it the demon I'm fighting. Now, his eight vices later turn into the 7 deadly sins. They drop one. But he also mentions 8 virtues. And so he interchanges demons and obsessive thoughts. But it kind of proves that he's just drawing a conclusion like Jesus says, anyone who lusts in their heart has already committed adultery in their lusts after another in their heart has already committed adultery in their heart. So Evagrius and the Desert Fathers, they're really keen about trying to discover, wait a minute, what first is in your heart? So Evagrius would always say, cut out those things from your heart, and then you'll find stillness. And so Evagrius is in line with Christ, who believed in cutting out certain things. And I'll give you an example. Like, he mentions vainglory. He does look at, and this is still the early church. We're still in the 300s. That some priests become priests not because they want to serve, but for vainglory. This idea that I'll be this great priest and I'll be the best at showing humility. But, you know, that's not being Christ the foot washer. That's just this form of pride. And he says, you know, if that's the reason why you become a priest, even though you might put on a great show of humility, you'll end up resenting the people because they didn't give you enough praises. And so, like, by constantly being aware of the demons that you're attracted to, the desert monks really pushed self-awareness. And so they had all these little sayings. So the third thing I'm going to mention is their whole idea of ascetical practices. So the desert monks, part of their spirituality was extreme asceticism. They believed in living in radical simplicity. They valued solitude and silence. And even with the simplicity, did notice, like I worked as a missionary priest for 4 years, where I had to put really the meager belongings I had into storage. And I lived out of a suitcase for 4 years. And this is the part that shocked me. So the part that shocked me is that, those were great 4 years. And you can live your entire life out of one suitcase and be completely happy. And then when I came back, I was like, oh, now I have to load up. And then when I came here, I was a little disappointed because I always traveled with just loading up my car, but now I had a U-Haul. Seriously, I did when I first got here. I had a U-Haul, and I was like, that's against the Desert Fathers. It shouldn't take much to make you happy. If it is, then you're not really very happy. So they valued absolute simplicity. And their daily life consisted of prayer, a little food, and very, very few possessions. Usually a stone hut or a cave, a reed mat, a sheepskin, a lamp. But they lived lives of asceticism, not for the sake of asceticism, but really as a way of staying awake and watching for the presence of God. Too much stuff and too much complicated life just interferes with your ability to hear Christ. And so there's this saying, and I like this. So the Desert Fathers have all these little sayings. I'll get to them in a minute. But one of them is, the more the wind blows against the tree, the deeper the roots grow. And so their position is that they did practice fasting and all these penances, not because of, self-hatred. They wanted to really push the roots of themselves down to the source of life. So, and here's the odd part. The Desert Fathers were noted for being people of joy and laughter, but likewise, extreme asceticism. They believed in a life of prayer. They believed in a life of penance, that you should always be doing penance, not because of punishment or that you're evil, just so that you can become happy. And there's this odd story in one of the desert sayings that this one monk goes to confession. I think this is hilarious. He goes to confession, and the priest gives him a penance of saying a prayer for 3 days. And the other monk says, well, no, I need more. How about a year? He says, no, I disagree. How about 1 day? And the Abba, who we went to confession, said, listen, your whole life is going to be penance. Why carry that reminder of the sin around? Do your penance, but your whole life is going to be penance anyhow. Does that make sense? And I love how for those who are really into penances, a life of penance, they weren't into giving heavy penances at confession. And there's this one Italian priest, I don't want to say his name, Father Bruno, who, he's not Olive Garden Italian. He's real Italian. And he's crazy. And I love him. But that's amazing, Mark. He was orphaned in World War II in Italy. Had a really hard life, but just, I love him because he's just existentially free and happy and wild. And a friend of mine who's a deacon went to confession to him, and went to confession, and this would be Father Bruno. Goes to confession and says a sin, and Bruno says, well, I don't know if that's really a sin. He says, are you even trying? Well, technically it's kind of a sin. He says, well, yeah, but come on. I mean, really? And so Bruno was like, I think you're being harsh on yourself. Is that really honest? And he had to think, he says, well, I guess I do have other things that are sins. But, you know what I mean? Like Bruno, the Desert Fathers, they're very much into daily penances, but not out of dislike or anything, or self-hatred. So even though they believed in extreme and constant asceticism, constant penance, they believed to be dour and have a sad disposition was itself a demon. Isn't that kind of interesting? Because you think a life of penance, you'd be kind of a negative person. But the monks were known for being more joyful because they were freed by penance. And they said, if you had no joy, then you missed the whole purpose of what the penance is supposed to do. A life of asceticism is supposed to give you freedom, this oneness with Christ. So you're joyful. And I know this sounds kind of strange. Have you ever met any priest with no joy? Where, I used to travel around. I met a lot of priests, and you'd meet some priests who were, very controlled, very armored up, very repressed, very sedate. And I guarantee you, there is a lot of skeletons in that closet. They have to be very controlled because they're hiding so much. Wouldn't it be better just to have a life of penance and be free from all your skeletons? So the desert monks wish to see and know Christ here and now, not in the future. So they wouldn't understand this modern idea of banking on heaven. Why wait? Why not do your penances now so you're completely free? And the odd part is, they had, a monk's cell. But a monk's cell, in one sense, looks a lot like a prison, right? Because all they had was a mat and a lamp. That's all they really had in their cells. And they make this connection that a monk's cell should kind of reflect a prison, but the very opposite of it. A prison is where you lose your freedom. A monk's cell is where you gain your freedom, because you don't need anything or any adulations. And even think of St. Paul when he was in prison. When St. Paul was in prison, he didn't become angry and frustrated and depressed and hopeless. In one of his prison cells, he sang praises. From another one, he ministered to other prisoners. And St. Paul and the desert monks, the cell could also be a place of freedom. And it's out of his imprisonment that St. Paul brings forth the word of God, and he calls it a demonos. He calls himself a demonos, a prisoner. But a prisoner who has he's a prisoner who's bound by shackles, but nothing else. So he might have been shackled, but not impeded. And so the point being is that I love a monk cell that is where you gain your freedom. So, the third thing about the desert spirituality is practicing a life of penance, not out of self-hatred, but really for Christ, to live a life of freedom and joy. The fourth characteristic of desert monks is just their prayer life. So what was their prayer life like? Well, remember, this is very early Christianity, so very unstructured. So they had three main things. One was, in their prayer life, they always did the hours, which is the Psalms. Now, just in case you forget what the hours are, its origins is Jewish. The reason why you have the book of Psalms is throughout the day, 5 times a day, you'd be praying Psalms. Now, the early Jews just memorized them. So the early monks, there was an early Christian practice in the early church, kept the liturgy of the hours. So throughout the day, they'd be praying certain Psalms. So that's their prayer book. The other thing that they would do, and I like this, is that they had a lot of mantras. So while they were working, because all they did was work and pray. And they'd often be repeating mantras to themselves. So, I think, as I said, my spirituality is only 5% Desert Fathers, but I do like that practice. I was in Costco the other day, and as long as I'm doing something mindless, I really do like repeating mantras to myself. So, mine was just, Jesus frees me, Jesus frees me. And I just keep repeating that in my head because I want to be free from my anxiety and my worries. And does that make any sense? So I just keep repeating it. And I know it sounds strange, but I just want to become part of me, or I often do. The word save, like Jesus saves, and free in the Greek is the same word. So I told you a story about the pilot who had the near-death experience where Okay, you guys don't remember that story, but he was a pilot, had a near-death experience where he's in his truck and he slumps over, dies, but he's suddenly before he dies, he knows he's not feeling well, and even though he's been, and technically he was Catholic, but stopped practicing faith, and just before he dies, he says, "Jesus saves me," and then he wakes up and he's outside his truck, and he sees some guy in his truck slumped over, and he's, "Who's in my truck?" And he looks and it's him. And then he goes up and gets to see hell, and he sees these 3 lights coming towards him, and they're angels. And I don't know if you remember the story. And they take him to Christ. But the angel saved him. He says, you did say Jesus saved me. That's was his last words. And after that, he resuscitated. Now he's a practicing Catholic. But didn't mean to get that much into it. But he did say, Jesus saved me. And I know that sounds kind of strange. I like praying, Jesus saves me too, because, I don't know, I hope in my heart of hearts that's the last prayer that maybe I'll utter, because I'm going to need all the help I can get. But if you're a desert monk, they had all these little mantras that you would just be chanting to yourself. I like mantras. So their prayer form was really easy. Litany of the Hours, mantras, and then the third, and this is the highest form of prayer they thought, was silence. Now, by silence, the Greek word for that is called hesychazonism. It doesn't really mean silence. Hesychazon is a type of prayer where you're completely free from all the chatter in your head. And so, like one of the popular sayings of the monks was, your cell has everything you need. So Christ comes from Christ's statement about go into your inner room and shut your door and pray. The monks believed shutting the door was shutting the door to all the distractions of the world, all the distractions of yourself, your own voices in yourself, so you achieve this stillness. So in absolute silence, you hear God. And it sounds strange, but remember the prophet who he goes and he's going to meet God, and God is not in the earthquake. God is not in the firestorm. God is not in all these big, loud things. And in the Hebrew, he hears God in silence. And so the problem is, it takes years to develop hesychazonism. You can remain, motionless for an hour, but really silence, stillness, hesychazon is really hard. Or I was on a retreat once, and this guy said, now, let's see how long you can go without any distracting thoughts. Have you ever done that? I last about 3 seconds. Seriously, try it. You can't go very long. But what if you were able to achieve silence as a type of prayer? Now, the liturgy of the hours and the mantras, they're just ways of slowly lowering all the chatter in your head. And do you remember the story I told, the desert story about the agitated water? So part of being a desert spirituality is being able to look at yourself. And Father Macarius says, it's like this pool of water where your life, you want stillness and silence. So all the ripples of the water become still. Then you can look at your true self. Only until things become silent and still. He said most people, they don't want to look at themselves. So they're always creating this drama and agitating the water because they really don't want to see themselves. And later, this famous mathematician / mystic, brilliant, Blaise Pascal, his question was, why does a king always require an entourage? Why does a king require an entourage? Because he needs a lot of distractions. Blaise Pascal said, most people are afraid to sit in a room in silence because then they're trapped in their own thoughts. They need a lot of distractions. Father Macarius was saying a lot of people, they want to constantly agitate the water because they don't want to attach anything. They don't want to look at themselves. And so in the Greek, they believe that hesychazonism. Now, I don't like the word silence because any of us can just remain, motionless. Hesychasm is to be free of all the chatter. And that leads to apotheia, which would be translated, quote unquote, non-attachment. But even the desert monks admitted it takes years before the outer attachments are completely free, where you have the stillness to completely see God. So by detachment, it means all those distractions. The other thing that comes up in the Desert Fathers' writings is the word murmuring, and it's this constant, near inaudible voice of complaining or comparing yourself or negative thoughts that is always playing in your head. Now, when they write about that, I don't know about you, but you know that's true, right? My number one sin is worry. And I use this image to myself that really there is a tape recorder going in the back of my mind of, oh my God, I'm going to be late for Mass. Oh my God, what about this? And it's barely audible, but it's always playing in the back of my head. Does that make sense? And so I physically imagine, turn that off because it's agitating me. The Desert Fathers talk about this constant murmuring, and it's such in the background, you may not be able to actually hear it. So this sounds kind of strange, but the desert monks said that silence almost never really exists. Isn't that kind of interesting? That there's always some sort of background noise that you're just so used to, you don't realize that you're hearing it. So they believed their prayer form was really simple. I should change this. Was Litany of the Hours, here's one. The mantras. But what you want to finally achieve is just hesychasm, where you have complete silence and then you hear the will of God. The other part, and Evagrius talks about this, is that I love about the Desert Fathers, is that the Desert Fathers practice kind of extreme honesty. If you belong, and there's men and women, but if you belong to their community, you had to practice what I would call extreme honesty. So remember, Evagrius, he names the virtues and vices, which is just such psychological insight. Now, the Bible says this, that vices love to dress themselves up as virtues, so they're harder to discern. And so, to discern the lust and gluttony and anger, they always present themselves as virtues. And you hear that where people say, I'm not angry. I just really care about justice. No, you're angry. We've all played that game. And so if you notice in the Bible, you always have this contrast where you have the Holy Spirit, Lady Wisdom, who goes around singing a song. Anybody who hears that song, she will prepare a feast, the Eucharist. But then you have Dame Fool, and she goes around screaming at people. And if you follow her, she'll promise you a great meal, but you'll end up worse off. So you always have these characters in the Bible where virtues always love to dress themselves up as something religious and good. And one of Evagrius' things that he mentions is illusions, the demon of illusion. And now this sounds kind of strange, but he mentions, I've met people who say, if I inherit a huge amount of money, I would give it to the poor. And I hate to say this, I have that demon sometimes, because if I won the lottery, I would give so much to the church. Not that that's a bad wish, but he said that's a demon of illusion that takes you out of reality. Why not just do what you need to right here and now, rather than say, well, when I have the money, I'll be generous. Why not be generous in other ways? Do you know what I mean? So I just love how they're really good at kind of naming anybody who says, well, I'll be generous once I win the lottery. That's a demon of illusion. And for the desert monks, guess which demon was the absolute most dangerous? Pride. And they said pride is a form of insanity, which I just like. Pride makes us arrogant and intolerant towards others. And the problem with pride is that you can't rationalize with it, so you simply have to kill it. If they'd say if you're intolerant of other people, that's a sign that you're under the demon of pride. And for the desert monks, like piety is not like folded hands and yards of lacy vestments and speaking in wispy tones. That's just theater. Does that make sense? A pious monk is one who can discern their vices and their virtues and always be working to be free. So for the desert monks, I really love their extreme honesty. And the reason why the desert monks were noted for their kindness in their spirituality is because they always searched out their own weaknesses. They're kind to other people's faults because they know their own faults and they don't make excuses. And so this sounds kind of strange. I imagine living in that desert community would have been a lot like attending an AA meeting. For this reason, have you ever attended an AA meeting? I was going with a friend just to support him. And, anyhow, well, now I'll tell you, I just thought of another story that was, so I attended the AA meeting, and I was kind of amazed because people would get up and, have these testimonials where, wow, they really ruined their life. But what I really liked is they would tell it all. They did this, they got drunk, you know what I mean? It was like this open confession. And the odd part was, it did strengthen my friend when he was working on his alcoholism, just to belong to a community that they don't hide any secrets. They keep each other accountable. And there was this non-judgment. Like this one woman told this terrible story about what a terrible mother she was because of alcoholism. But she didn't get condemnation. She got support. And I was like, oh my God, that's what it must have been like to be part of a desert community. The real thing that desert monks hated was pious displays that are just being a phony. So, they always practice extreme honesty, no excuses. Oh, why I was smiling is that my friend, when I was supporting him going to an AA meeting, he was traveling, so he found out where an AA meeting was. Now, you have to understand, just the AA meetings, to me, it was like I should have had popcorn. Like, no. So my friend, who's kind of conservative, he called me and he says, oh, he's so embarrassed because he said he went to an essay meeting by accident. That he asked where and they said, oh, down the hall, and they took him to an essay of sex addiction. And I was like, oh my God, what do they talk about? And he says, I don't know, I was so nervous, I was afraid somebody would call on me and I wouldn't have anything to share. Anyhow, sorry, got distracted. But if you entered the desert community, it wasn't to be superior to other people. That's the way of the world. It was to become truly human. And how can you become truly human unless you can be incredibly honest with your own faults? So there's a story about a desert monk he's dying. And he says, I came to the desert, I ate the bread of my own labor, and I've never been sorry for anything. So I die, only have begun in the Lord's service. Like, he was never really honest. Does that make, wow, that's a great story. So being honest about one's faults and virtues is not, they dislike appearing as honest and loving. They demanded that everybody has their own struggles, and so you know how to be compassionate with the weak because you're so good at your own struggles. And that's what makes the desert monks' advice so good, because they draw on a wealth of their own experience. And no offense, it's not like St. Francis, where St. Francis' spirituality is poverty and creation, or the Benedictines that come from the sacraments, or the Dominicans. The Dominican spirituality comes from, studying the Bible. The desert monks' main source of reflection was their own sins. And so they're very much into not ever judging other people's sins. The only thing that they disliked is self-righteousness. So there's a story about Abbot Moses, who two of the monks, a man and a woman, are caught in the act of fornication. And so they call Abbot Moses to come and judge the two. And the story is Abbot Moses shows up, but he has this huge basket on his back full of sand that's just pouring out of the holes. So he comes and he says, yes. And they said, why are you carrying a basket of sand on your back? And he says, because you've called me to come here and judge these two people when my own sins pour out among you. And so they all looked at each other and they went back to their cells. There's no reason to judge them there, and what they did was wrong. Does that make sense? So they have these stories that we really don't need to judge each other. We want to spend our time judging ourselves. And this sounds kind of strange. So in their stories and stuff, the monks often tell stories about their own weaknesses. But it sounds kind of strange. Have you ever been to a mass where it's a type of authoritarianism, where you can get this, where the priest, when he preaches, he does preach ethics, but it's ethics at you. You're getting preached at what's wrong with you and what's wrong with you and you need to do this, rather than preach to you. If it's to you, it's, not necessarily my own faults, but just human nature. Does that mean where you can get on board? If it's at you, you can't really get on board. Does that make any sense? So the desert monks, if you read their writings and stuff, it's so tied to kind of this humility of what it means to be a human being that it's not at you, it's to you. And the one thing they couldn't stand is when you're lying to yourself. And I don't know if I remember I told you a story, but there's this great story about Abbot Macarius, Abbot Macarius, he's praying and he sees the devil walk by. And when the devil walks by, he has all this coat. And in the coat is filled with all these pockets with little vials. And he stops the devil and he says, where are you going? And he says, I'm going to go visit an old friend. And he said, well, what's in the little vials? And he says, different sins. And he said, this monk is a good friend of mine. He'll take everything because he lives in denial. So Abbot Macarius asks the name of the young monk, and he tells him. So then Abbot Macarius goes and then visits a monk. And when he visits the young monk, the monk is surprised because Abbot Macarius is known for his holiness. And Abbot Macarius talks to him and says, well, I just want to be honest, sometimes I have a problem with lust. And the monk, the young monk, who was very concerned about appearances, says, sometimes I do too. So yeah, they talk about that. And then Abbot Macarius says, and I'm still wrestling with the demon of anger. And the young monk says, well, to be honest, so am I. Then the next week, he sees the devil walking back looking sad. And he said, why does he look sad? And the devil said, well, my old friend, the one, he no longer accepts any of my vials. He's learned honesty. Like, don't you love that? Like, so Macarius just went and shared his sins with him. But, anyhow, the devil, if you're truly a humble person, you can name the truth about yourself. You don't have to be naming it at other people. And so the monks have this idea of the mask behind the mask. So put it this way. What is the true self? What is your true self? The problem is the monks believe that there's always layers of masks that we live with. So what is a true self? Now, they'd say you really only know yourself in relationship to other people, but sometimes in life you think that you are your mask, but you're not. And you're saying, I don't get what you're talking about. So somebody told me this story about his mother-in-law, whose mother-in-law turned out to be, at the end of her life, a really, really sweet person. However, when she was younger, well, not younger, but when she was playing the role of a grandmother, she's Italian, and she grew up where she was the matriarch of the family. And he was going to take the kids down to the beach, and the grandmother says, "You're not taking my kids. You're not taking my grandchildren out to the beach, not unless there's more than one supervisor. What if you turn your back and something happens?" And so she insisted, "No, you will be taking somebody else with you." And so, like, he loved his mother-in-law, but she was always played the role of the matriarch who's in charge of the family. But later in life, when she gave up that role, what she really was sweet. Well, she was actually sweet all along. But she had the mask of, I'm in charge, because that's her position in life. Does that make sense? So do you really know your true self, or you just know the mask that you're given to play? Or and the mother is a mother mask sometimes. Or, I hate to say this, I know 2 doctors. And a doctor, if you're a doctor or a priest or something, it's a type of mask in a way. It's not a lie, but it's what I have to, So anyhow, know these 2 doctors in Boise, and both of them retire. And one of them stuns me. He's so generous. And I don't mean financially, I mean like helping out with everything, helping out the parish, setting up. You can ask him to do anything, and he is a worker bee. Does that make sense? And the other doctor, he did also retired, but he was very involved in the church, but always from a position that solidifies his position as doctor, slightly above people. So you really don't ever count on him to help. He'll tell you what you need to do, but he'll never really pitch in. Does that make sense? And so the odd part is that he's a good person, but wow, he hasn't taken off the mask of a doctor, even though he's retired. Nobody's getting your coffee. We're not your nurses. Does that make the other one, he did wear the mask of a doctor, and he was a good doctor. But once he retired, I mean, technically he's a doctor, but now he's just a servant. So I know. The monks talk about dropping a mask to find your true self. Well, that can only happen with extreme honesty. The 6th point about desert spirituality is everybody has an Abba. So an Abba just means father. So the role of the Abba was kind of crucial. They did believe in equality in their communities, but an Abba was a spiritual director, usually older. And when a person was caught up with giving their life to Christ as a monk, they would have to seek a relationship with an Abba or an Amma. They also had Ammas, that's a mother. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. But there are men and women who are Abbas and Ammas. And the Abba's role was to read another's heart. And so knowledge of others, to read the hearts of others and know more about another than they know about themselves. And that was only born from a life of self-knowledge. And so the Abba had to be one who had wrestled with the truth himself before they could be a spiritual director to somebody else. And so Abba Maccabeus said this, and I like this line where he says, "If the deepest truth of ourselves is the ground of being we all share, then truly to know yourself is to know the deepest knowledge of others. The knowledge of the clay that you are made of is to know the clay that all pots are made of." Isn't that beautiful? So do you like that or not? I think it's great. But so this sounds kind of strange. To live in a desert community, you would always have to have a spiritual director, an Abba, who would kind of guide you. And you'd go to your Abba and you'd say, "Give me a word." That was our little phrase, "Give me a word." The Abba would not teach a class or give theology or counseling. You would just get a word. A word was a saying or a story, and then you would have to go and figure it out. Why did the Abba tell me that story? And the words are either saying or story, and then they'd have an honest discussion. And so, like Christ, the desert monks, they preferred to do their teaching through stories rather than, abstract theological principles. So they didn't have many written prayers, but the ground of their prayers was really their own being. It's kind of interesting because at the time period of the desert monks, you have all these great theological arguments going on. They didn't want theological stories. They just wanted, they didn't want theological arguments and what is that Greek word? All they used was stories. But the role of the Abba was to be a spiritual director. The seventh point, and that gets me, is the desert sayings. They're called the desert sayings, but they could be stories. So when somebody would say, give me a word, the word was their sayings. They're usually pithy and direct, kind of an economy of words. They're like a parable or a peasant folk wisdom, a little bit of practical advice that you had to figure out. Now, here's the problem. If you read the desert sayings, the sayings aren't really consistent to one another, and that's the point. They'll write down the sayings, but like the desert, like Father Macarius, there's a story of Father Macarius. Somebody comes with one sin, and Macarius tells him this story. Another monk comes with the very similar sins, but he tells them an opposite story. So they go to him and they said, well, why did you give us two opposite set of advice? Because your problem, although it may be the same sin, you come from a different background than him. Does that make sense? So they have all these sayings, but you have to kind of figure out how to apply it. Now, I have to warn you, that happens in the Bible all the time. Jesus does that. And so if you're an atheist, you'll say, see, the Bible contradicts itself. Well, not really a contradiction, but Jesus' exact phrase in this situation is, the same words, but a completely different situation. Does that make sense? So, like when atheists do that, because it's taken out of context. Advice for one person won't work with another because the context has changed. Now, as I said, the desert monks are giving to law, really, and they'll discuss anything, sex, temptations, everything. As I said, the only thing they really disliked was self-righteousness. So another saying, I just like this one, and now I forgot it. But it goes something like this. Abbot Procopius said, a daily insult is like daily watering a tree. And you think, what? But the point being is that a daily insult, that's like watering a tree, because if you're living your Christian life for glory or something like that, maybe you do need a little insult. How do you know an insult doesn't make you lose your ego? And so it's not that the insult is nice, but, it's a way to grow your roots deeper. Does that make any sense? So they have all these little ones. Or another one is, I think this is funny because I think it to myself all the time, where they ask Father Macarius, this guy complains, he says, I tell you, with food, I can't stop eating. I don't want to, but I can't stop eating. And Macarius says, are you a donkey? And what he means by that, like a donkey, he'll eat as much food as you give him. Does that make sense? He has no choice. That's donkey nature. But a human in the Garden of Eden, remember, God gave us always a choice. We can choose our own destiny. That we were made, that we can choose our own destiny. A donkey will always act like a donkey. But a human is free to make his choice. Now, we're not really completely free because of sin, but that's what a life of penance does. And if you're truly a free person, you can deny yourself food. I say that because I just thought earlier today I'm a donkey because he's evil. Somebody dropped off cookies, and I'm trying to give up sugar, and it was chocolate chip, and I had a cup of coffee, so before class I was drinking. I was like, oh my God, I'm such a donkey. I said I wouldn't eat it, and I'm eating it. But those are the little sayings. Here's the odd part, and this sounds kind of strange. Some of the sayings are just questions. But I know I told you this. In the gospel, Jesus is asked a question 183 times. But over 307 times, he answers other people with questions. The odd part is that Jesus doesn't answer questions. He asks questions. Isn't that kind of amazing? So if you think, well, Christ will give you the answer. No, Christ will give you a question. And you have to wrestle with a question. So when somebody says, give me a word, the abbot really asks you a question. And even last week, one parishioner asked me a question about myself, so I answered it. I can always answer anything. But in all honesty, it was a question from God. And that question has been bugging me all week long. So I've been thinking about it. Now, yeah, I did answer it, but I didn't really, even when I was answering it, I was like, I don't know why I do that. Like, I really don't. And there's this great theologian. You want to write this one down. This great theologian, write this down. Her name is Judge Judy. And Judge Judy, I like to watch her if I get to run across her. And Judge Judy, she once said, she asked some guy a question. And the guy gives this long, belabored answer. And then Judge Judy says, can I ask you a question? Why is it the male species is incapable of the three little words, I don't know? You gave me a long answer, but why didn't you just say, I don't know? I thought that was funny. So I did give a long answer, but in all honesty, when they asked the question, it was about myself, I don't know. And then I've been asking myself, why is that? And here's the odd part. It deals with just some of my shadow side, some of my impulses. Why? I don't know. Like, even this morning in the shower, I was like, maybe I do it this way. Now, I think I have half the answer now after a week, but here's the odd part. What if I never got a complete answer? Isn't just the fact that when that person asked a question, I thought it was the voice of Christ asking me, isn't it good enough that I just wrestle with a question, not get the complete answer? Does that make sense? So the desert sayings, they're not about giving you any answers. They're made to provoke questions that you have to answer yourself. So Jesus asks a lot more questions. The eighth thing about desert spirituality is hospitality. I know that sounds strange, but they had this reputation for austerity and severity and harshness, but that was just on themselves, not on other people. So in their writings, one of their top priority when it came to others was always showing hospitality. So there are countless sayings about providing hospitality to other people. If you seek God, that should never separate you from other people. So if you're separated from other people, that is just you're a prisoner of your own selfhood. And that would be really a form of hell. And I mention that because you still find that today. Remember when I first came to St. Pius, I'm terrible with names. And there's all these people. So I thought, wouldn't it be great to have Name Take Sunday? Like 4 times a year, have Name Take Sunday. So, like, if it's true with me, like, I can see you all the time, but I forget your name. You told me 2 months ago. Wouldn't that be true of everybody in the pew? So why don't we have a Name Take Sunday so that you can say, that's her, Gloria, that's her name. You know what I mean? So I said, why don't we have, I wanted to have a Name Take Sunday, and this one woman said, absolutely not. I think that's disgusting. She says, I don't go to church to meet other people. I go because I'm focused on Christ on the altar, not other people. I was like, oh, wow, I got work to do here. But like, that's the prison of your own selfhood. And then you think you're focused on God, but you're not. So the Desert Fathers, a lot of the things deal with hospitality. If you can't welcome other people, you've come into the desert not to flee the world, You've come into the desert to flee Christ, and then you call yourself religious. So this sounds kind of strange. The monks were going to pray, and there's some woman who needed help. So a monk helps her, and he misses his prayer. And she said, Father, I'm so sorry that I took you away from your duty to Christ. And he says, no, I didn't miss my duty of Christ. Hospitality was demanded more than prayer time. You know what I mean? They always have these stories of hospitality. Now, it's not hospitality of this diffuse kind of, I want to be the superficial, fakey sweet to other people. They believed it was really hard work to get to love. That love in its full sense, it demands a complete transformation. Love is this death. And if you can't show hospitality, then you haven't died enough. So this sounds really strange. I mentioned this, and then another woman got really upset with me. Because I believe in hospitality. And Father Anthony, St. Anthony of the Desert, believed in hospitality. And he says, there must be something good in the devil because the devil continues to exist. If God wanted, he could wipe him out in an instant. So God must love the devil. Now, anybody have a problem with that? Okay, let me explain. Think about this. I do this with the kids. God is love. It says in the Book of Wisdom, anything that exists because I love it. If I withdraw my presence from any part of creation, it falls back into nothingness. So in the Book of Wisdom, God says, I am incapable of hatred. So, wow, that's it. God is incapable of hatred. So St. Anthony believed, the devil, God must love the devil. So here's my question. Like on a percentage, what percentage does God love the Virgin Mary? 100%. What percentage does God love Gloria? What percentage does God love the devil? What's the difference between the Virgin Mary and the devil? The Virgin Mary can return it 100%. The devil can't return any love. Does that make sense? So, St. Anthony was asked, well, what would you do if the devil came to your door? He said, I would show him hospitality. Right? That's kind of... So that's a really odd... Well, I'd even show the devil, the worst enemy of humanity, hospitality, because that's my nature. That's not his. His nature is in hospitality. Does that make any sense? So, so anyhow, that's enough of that. Can I... One more story. I like the desert sayings. So, some monks caught some robbers, and then the robbers were thrown in jail, and when the Abba finds out about it, he's furious that they didn't show hospitality to the robbers, and so he chews them out. So the monks gathered together, and they decided that they got to go free him, so they broke into jail and released the prisoners. Now, it's a funny little story, right? But it's, once again, a story to make you think, what? They believed in extreme hospitality. So, this sounds kind of strange. I have homework for you. I wrote down the 8 things that I spoke about, but here's the homework. And I do this all the time. You know the rosary, the mystery of the rosaries? Actually, the Catholic tradition is you can come up with your own rosary. You can come up with your own mysteries. So how about this? Your homework is to come up for 1 week a mystery. Oh, I totally forgot changing these. Your homework is to come up with your own rosary based on, I meant to do this so you could see different sayings of the fathers. To come up with your own rosary based on some of the spirituality tactics of the Desert Fathers. So I wrote down all 8 here because I didn't think some of you guys would pay attention. So here, distribute those. So any questions? We have like 3 or 4 minutes. Questions, objections? Yeah. Yes, that's why they believed in mantras. Yeah, so it sounds strange that if you want to learn how to silence your mind, practice mantras or rosaries, but it does keep that murmuring in your voice to a silence until you can have true hesychasnism. Okay, sorry, I think I got shocked with St. Anthony's story about the devil, but who do you want to be like? Christ, the source of hospitality, or the devil, the source of inhospitality? So, on that, thank you guys for the coffee. Next week, we're going to cover Celtic spirituality. So I'm going to jump ahead 400 years to Ireland. So, all right, God bless. See you guys later.